The grand chandelier above the elegant dining hall glittered like a crown of light. Crystal glasses chimed softly, and the low hum of polite conversation filled the air. It was one of those nights at the Lancaster Estate Gala where old money mingled with new faces, and everyone pretended the world outside didn't exist. At the far end of the table sat Margaret Lancaster, a silver-haired billionaire known for her grace, influence, and a smile that could silence an entire boardroom. Tonight her eyes seemed distant, heavy, with years of hidden stories. She didn't notice the young black waitress approaching until a soft voice said, "Excuse me, ma'am, may I refill your glass?" Margaret looked up. The waitress's name tag read Amara. Her movements were calm and graceful, yet there was something familiar, something unsettling, in the way she carried herself. When Amara bent slightly to pour the wine, a small silver necklace slipped from beneath her uniform, catching the chandelier's light. Margaret froze. Her hand trembled around the glass. The pendant, that simple heart-shaped locket, was identical to the one her granddaughter had worn the day she disappeared 20 years ago. Her breath caught. Her mind raced. The world around her blurred into silence as she stared at that glimmering charm, as if time itself had folded in half. Who was this young woman? How could she possibly have that necklace? Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. The memories she'd buried for decades began clawing their way back, and in that instant she realized this wasn't going to be an ordinary evening. It's free, and it helps us grow. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications for more true, emotional, and powerful stories that touch the heart. The evening's warmth was fading fast inside Margaret Lancaster's chest. The sound of music and laughter drifted like ghosts through the ballroom, but her thoughts had already drifted far from the gala's golden glow. Her mind kept circling back to the necklace, to the waitress, to that unbearable flicker of familiarity that wouldn't let her go. Margaret Lancaster wasn't just another name in society columns. She was the Lancaster, the matriarch of one of New York's oldest families, owner of the Lancaster Foundation for Children, and the woman known for her unbreakable poise. But beneath the diamonds and velvet, she carried a wound that never healed. 20 years ago, her only granddaughter, Clara, vanished without a trace during a family trip to Georgia. The tragedy had fractured her family and hardened Margaret's once warm heart into marble. After the loss, she had built walls around her mansion, her emotions, and her conscience. Money and philanthropy became her distractions. And as the years rolled by, she learned to wear her grief like another piece of jewelry, beautiful, cold, and untouchable. Yet tonight that fragile control was slipping. She tried to focus on the speeches being given from the stage, on the way her guests toasted her generosity, but the young waitress kept reappearing in her peripheral vision. Margaret noticed the smooth confidence in her stride, the humble way she served, and the quiet strength in her eyes. It wasn't arrogance, it was something else, something familiar. Her mind kept whispering, "No, it can't be." But the heart she'd long ignored refused to listen. As Amara passed by again, Margaret found herself studying her face. The curve of her jaw, the faint dimple when she smiled politely, even the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. All of it pulled Margaret deeper into a haunting sense of déjà vu. It wasn't just the necklace. There was something in her, in the way she existed, that felt connected to everything Margaret had lost. For the rest of the evening, Margaret could barely engage with her guests. Her fork clattered against the china, her champagne went untouched, and her polite smile had vanished completely. When the final toast ended, Margaret's old instincts returned, the instincts of a woman who didn't become a billionaire by chance. She waited, observed, measured. Then when the crowd began to thin, she quietly rose from her seat, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She followed Amara from a distance, through the swinging kitchen doors and into the narrow hallway behind the ballroom. A world apart from the crystal chandeliers and string quartet. Here, the air smelled of coffee and detergent. The staff laughed softly, unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows. Margaret's pulse quickened. She didn't know what she was searching for. Truth, closure, maybe even forgiveness. But she knew she couldn't leave without answers. Then, just as Amara turned the corner toward the service elevator, Margaret caught sight of her again. The necklace glinted once more beneath the fluorescent light, and this time, Margaret's knees nearly gave out. The locket wasn't just similar, it was the same one. The same tiny dent on the left edge, the same engraving on the back that only one person could have known about. The words flashed in her mind like lightning. To Clara, my little star. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Her hands began to tremble. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt solid. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "That's impossible." The sound of the kitchen door swinging shut broke her trance. Amara had disappeared into the back corridor, leaving Margaret standing there, breathless and shaken. In that moment, Margaret realized this night wasn't about business or reputation anymore. It was about the truth. A truth that had been buried under time, silence, and guilt for far too long, and she wasn't leaving until she found it. Margaret couldn't sleep that night. The mansion was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the hall, a sound that had comforted her for decades but now felt almost mocking. Every tick echoed like a reminder of lost years, of unanswered questions, of a truth that was clawing its way back into her life. She sat in her armchair by the window, the city lights shimmering far below. On the table beside her, she'd placed an old photograph, faded, creased, and worn thin from years of grief. It showed a laughing little girl in pigtails holding a silver locket shaped like a star. Clara Margaret's eyes burned as she traced her finger over the child's smile. That same locket now hung from the neck of a young black waitress she'd never met before. A waitress who couldn't have been more than 25, the same age Clara would have been now. Her rational mind screamed for logic. There had to be an explanation. Coincidence, theft, a cheap replica. Something simple and rational. But her heart refused to surrender that easily. There was something about that girl's eyes, the gentle way she spoke to others, that soft empathy in her posture. It wasn't something that could be faked. By dawn, Margaret's decision was made. She needed answers. The following afternoon, Margaret returned to the restaurant. It wasn't her style to chase ghosts, but this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about finding peace, or at least the truth behind that necklace. When she walked in, the hostess greeted her with the same polite smile as the night before, unaware of the storm brewing beneath Margaret's calm exterior. She took a seat by the corner, her sharp eyes scanning the room until she saw her, Amara, moving gracefully between tables, her hair neatly tied back, her smile faint but genuine. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The resemblance to her granddaughter was almost unbearable now that she was looking for it. But what truly shook her was the feeling, the same feeling she used to get when Clara would run into her arms. For a long moment, Margaret just watched. Every gesture, every word Amara spoke to a guest seemed filled with quiet strength. She carried herself with the kind of dignity Margaret's own world often lacked. Then, as Amara leaned to clear a table, the necklace slipped from beneath her vest and caught the light again. The sight felt like a blow to Margaret's chest. She reached into her purse, her hand trembling, and pulled out an identical locket, or rather what she thought was identical. It had been found in the wreckage after Clara's disappearance, a symbol of loss she'd clung to for 20 years. And now there were two. Hours later, when the last of the lunch crowd had gone, Margaret approached the manager quietly and asked to speak to the waitress named Amara. The man, recognizing her prestige, nodded quickly and went to fetch her. As Margaret waited, she tried to steady herself, her hands clasped around the locket so tightly that the edges pressed into her skin. Finally, Amara appeared, polite, calm, her expression slightly puzzled at seeing the elderly woman again. Margaret took a deep breath, her words failing her before they even formed. So instead, she did something instinctive. She lifted the locket in her palm and set it gently on the table between them. The air seemed to thicken. Amara froze, her gaze locking onto the pendant. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes flickering with something raw. Recognition, maybe fear. Slowly, almost involuntarily, she reached up and touched her own necklace, pulling it free from under her vest. Two silver lockets, side by side, identical down to the last scratch. The world around them fell away. No clinking dishes, no humming of kitchen staff. Just silence. Margaret's throat went dry. Memories came rushing back. The day Clara vanished, the endless police reports, the sleepless nights, the whispers about the kidnapping that never made sense. She stared at the young woman across from her and whispered a name that hadn't left her lips in 2 decades. Clara. Though the word was silent, Amara seemed to feel it. She stepped back, shaking her head, her breathing uneven. Margaret's mind was a storm, disbelief battling hope, fear wrestling with joy. Could this woman truly be her lost granddaughter? Or was fate simply cruel enough to dangle a painful illusion before her? In the days that followed, Margaret's obsession deepened. She quietly ordered a private investigator, an old family contact, to look into Amara's background. Within 48 hours, she had a report in hand. The file revealed what Amara herself had likely never known. She had been adopted as an infant after being found abandoned in a small town outside Savannah, Georgia, the same place where Clara had disappeared all those years ago. No birth certificate, no record of her biological family. Margaret's hands trembled as she turned the final page. There, clipped to the back, was a photograph of the infant wrapped in a hospital blanket, with the same tiny star-shaped locket hanging around her neck. Tears she hadn't shed in years finally fell. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just a dream. Amara was Clara. But joy wasn't the only emotion surging through her. As she stared at the photograph, guilt flooded in like a tide she couldn't stop. Because beneath the love and relief was an unbearable truth, one she had spent years burying. Margaret had been part of a family that once looked down upon anyone who didn't fit their narrow, privileged image. The investigation back then had been handled quietly. Too quietly. The police hadn't looked very far, especially in the poorer, mostly black neighborhoods near where Clara went missing. They had dismissed leads that didn't fit the narrative, and Margaret hadn't questioned it. Now, as she stared at the grown woman who had unknowingly lived a life shaped by those same injustices, she felt something break inside her. She realized that the world that had once protected her had failed her granddaughter, failed her family, and failed Amara most of all. The next evening, Margaret returned to the restaurant, not as a billionaire, not as a patron, but as a grandmother seeking redemption. As she waited for Amara to finish her shift, she replayed 1,000 apologies in her mind, yet none seemed enough. Amara stepped out of the kitchen, surprised to see her again. For a moment their eyes met, one filled with confusion, the other overflowing with a love too long suppressed. Margaret stood, her trembling fingers reaching once more toward the necklace that started it all. This time, when Amara didn't pull away, tears filled Margaret's eyes. She whispered something under her breath, words only the heart could hear. And though no one else in that restaurant noticed, something sacred happened in that moment. 2 lost souls, separated by time, race, and tragedy, began to recognize each other again. The air inside the restaurant was thick with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Margaret and Amara sat opposite each other in a small corner booth, their faces lit by the soft amber glow of the hanging light. Between them lay the 2 lockets, identical, silent witnesses to a truth long buried. Amara's hands trembled as she held hers. She had worn that necklace her entire life, a simple silver locket that her adoptive mother said was found with her when she was a baby. She never questioned it. But now, the sudden weight of history pressed on her chest, demanding answers she wasn't ready for. Margaret's eyes were red, but steady. Years of grief, denial, and privilege had hardened her, But in this moment, she was stripped bare, a grandmother standing before the ghost of her lost child. She took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly. Amara didn't respond. Her gaze locked on the older woman's trembling fingers. 22 years ago, Margaret began, her voice shaking. "My granddaughter was taken from me. We searched for years. But the police stopped looking. They told us she was gone, that there was nothing left to find." Her words cracked as memories resurfaced, the long nights, the empty nursery, the endless silence that followed. "They said she must have wandered off. Or worse," she whispered. But deep down, I knew something else had happened. Something darker. I just didn't have the courage to face it. Amara's eyes flickered with confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. Margaret exhaled shakily. "My family, they were powerful. We had influence, money, and with that came blindness. The investigators were more loyal to us than to justice. They looked for her in the places we told them to, never where the truth really was." Amara's heart pounded. "And where was that?" Margaret looked up, tears streaking down her face. "In the neighborhoods your people lived in," she whispered. "They didn't think anyone there could be innocent. They didn't think anyone there deserved to be listened to." The words hit Amara like a physical blow. She felt her pulse in her ears, her chest tightening with rage and sorrow. "So you're saying," she began, her voice trembling. Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes. The system that was supposed to save my granddaughter didn't care, because she was found by a black family, and because no one in power thought that was worth investigating." Amara's breath caught. Her adoptive mother, a kind woman who had worked as a nurse, had once told her how she found her on the steps of an old church in Savannah. No one came forward to claim her. They had gone through the process, filled the forms, and given her a home. She had never known that the child she raised had been searched for by one of the richest families in America, a family that had stopped looking because of the color of the hands that held her. Margaret continued, her voice breaking with remorse. "I realized too late how wrong it all was. My money, my name, none of it could buy back the years I lost with you. I failed you. I failed your mother. And I failed myself." For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the echo of memories that refused to die. Then Amara's eyes fell on the photograph Margaret held out. A small, faded image of a smiling baby with the same silver star necklace. Her breath hitched as recognition hit her like lightning. She had seen that photo before. In a dream, or maybe a memory buried deep within her. The wallpaper, the blanket, the soft sunlight, it all came rushing back in flashes she couldn't explain. Margaret's hand shook as she reached across the table. "Clara," she whispered. Amara's lips quivered. She wanted to deny it, to reject this painful miracle, but something inside her gave way. The ache, the lost memories, the way she always felt out of place, even in a loving home. It all suddenly made sense. Tears filled her eyes. "I'm not her," she said weakly, though her voice betrayed the truth. "Yes," Margaret whispered, "you are. And I'm so sorry." Amara broke. Years of confusion, pain, and identity struggle poured out in a single trembling sob. Margaret reached forward instinctively but hesitated until Amara leaned in, collapsing into her arms. The two women clung to each other, crying, not just for the years they'd lost, but for the generations of pain that had kept them apart. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since her granddaughter vanished. Forgiveness, not given by others, but by the universe itself. Outside, rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, almost symbolic. They sat there in silence, holding each other as the storm passed. But the story didn't end there. because when Amara looked up again, she saw something shift in Margaret's eyes. Not just love, but determination. "I can't change the past," Margaret said, her tone firm now, "but I can make sure what happened to us never happens again." And in that moment, Amara saw not a billionaire or a stranger, but a woman reborn through regret, ready to use her power for something greater than herself. The storm had passed, but its echo remained in the hush of the night. Outside the restaurant windows, the city glistened, streets washed clean by rain, lights reflecting like stars scattered across wet pavement. Inside, Margaret and Amara sat in quiet stillness, two souls bound by a truth that had shattered and healed them at once. Margaret looked down at her wrinkled hands. Hands that had signed contracts worth millions, that had built empires and destroyed bridges without even realizing it. But tonight, they had done something she never thought possible. They had held forgiveness. Amara sat across from her, eyes still glistening with tears, but calmer now, softer. There was a peace settling inside her, one that came from finally knowing where she came from and what she was worth. She had lived her life thinking she was small, ordinary, replaceable. But now she saw herself through the reflection of two worlds, one that had abandoned her and one that had embraced her. And somehow, she belonged to both. Margaret took a deep breath, her voice quiet but steady. "You shouldn't have had to grow up without knowing your family. That was our failure. But I don't want the rest of your life defined by what we lost. I want it defined by what we do now." Amara nodded slowly. "Then let's make it mean something." And so in the months that followed, the Lancaster Foundation for Justice was born, a non-profit created by the most unlikely pair, a black waitress and a white billionaire. Its mission was simple but profound, to help reconnect lost children with their families and to fight against the systemic inequalities that had once torn theirs apart. The media went wild when the story broke. Billionaire heiress finds lost granddaughter among restaurant staff. But Margaret refused to make it about wealth or fame. She turned every interview toward Amara's courage, her story, and the uncomfortable truths about privilege, race, and power that society often preferred to ignore. For Amara, life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were questions, doubts, and even resentment from both sides. People who couldn't accept her dual identity. But through it all, she stood firm, because she now understood something deeper than bloodlines. That family isn't just who you're born to, but who refuses to give up on you once they find you. One afternoon, months later, Margaret visited Amara's new community center, a place where young girls from struggling neighborhoods came to study, eat, and dream. The walls were covered in bright murals painted by the kids themselves, and in the center of the room, framed behind glass, hung the two matching necklaces, side by side, no longer symbols of loss, but of reunion. Margaret smiled softly as she read the inscription below them. What was lost in pain was found in love. As she turned to leave, a little girl tugged at Amara's sleeve and whispered, "Is she your grandma?" Amara smiled, that same quiet, warm smile that once melted a billionaire's pride. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with peace. "She is. And she's everyone's grandma now." The little girl giggled and ran off, leaving the two women standing in the sunlight streaming through the window. Margaret reached for Amara's hand. "You've changed me," she said softly. Amara looked at her, eyes gleaming. "No," she replied. "We changed each other." The light caught the twin necklaces one last time. Two hearts that had once been separated by prejudice and pain, now reunited by forgiveness and grace. And for the first time in her long life, Margaret Lancaster finally felt rich in a way money could never measure. Support Real Flow Stories. Every view, like, and comment helps us bring more true, emotional, and eye-opening stories to light. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell so you never miss a story that moves your soul.